The morning sun barely touched the horizon when the unmarked government sedan pulled up to the main gate of Naval Air Station Oceana. Virginia Beach stretched behind it, still wrapped in pre-dawn silence. The base ahead hummed with the first stirrings of another day, jets being prepped on distant flight lines, security lights beginning to fade against the growing daylight. The woman who stepped out of the back seat wore no uniform. Just dark jeans, a simple gray pullover, and worn leather boots that had seen more miles than most sailors would walk in a year. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, a few strands catching the wind off the Atlantic. She carried a single black duffel bag over her shoulder, the kind you could buy at any surplus store. The security guard at the gate booth glanced up from his clipboard, eyes moving over her civilian clothes with the practiced disinterest of someone who'd checked 1,000 IDs that week. He took her badge, scanned it, and barely looked at the name. "Temporary assignment?" he asked, already reaching for the entry log. "Something like that," she replied, her voice quiet and even. He handed back the badge and waved her through without another word. Behind him, 2 Marines stood near the security barrier, coffee cups in hand, their conversation drifting across the early morning air. "Another contractor," one said, watching her pass. "Probably here to fix the new logistics software that nobody asked for." The other Marine chuckled. "Hope she types faster than she walks. We've got 3 systems down already this week." She heard them, but didn't turn. Just adjusted the duffel on her shoulder and kept walking, her eyes already scanning the base layout ahead. The hangars to the east, the administration building directly ahead, the flight line stretching north where the sound of turbine engines was beginning to rise. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Everything about the way she moved suggested someone who belonged here, even if nothing about her appearance said so. Her posture was too straight, her stride too measured, the way her eyes tracked movement across the tarmac, noting the positions of aircraft, the flow of personnel, the gaps in the morning routine. It was the gaze of someone who saw systems, not just scenery. She passed a group of junior officers heading toward the mess hall, their conversation loud and confident. One of them glanced her way, took in the civilian clothes, and dismissed her just as quickly. "Contractors get earlier access every year," he muttered to his companion. "Next thing you know, they'll be running the briefings too." Inside the main administration building, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that familiar institutional glow. The lobby smelled like burnt coffee and copy machine toner. A television mounted in the corner played a silent news feed. Images of aircraft carriers and international waters scrolling past without sound. She approached the reception desk where a young petty officer sat, fingers flying across a keyboard, eyes locked on a screen filled with what looked like scheduling conflicts. "Ma'am," he said without looking up. "Can I help you?" She slid a folder across the desk. Plain manila, no markings except a single routing code stamped in red ink on the corner. "Reporting for temporary assignment. Office of the CAG. CAG Commander, Air Group. The officer responsible for all aircraft operations on the base." The petty officer finally looked up, took the folder, and opened it. His eyes skimmed the first page, then the second. He frowned slightly, as if something didn't quite add up, but he didn't ask questions. The routing code was legitimate. The orders looked proper. And he had 20 other people to process before noon. "All right, ma'am," he said, typing her information into the system. "You'll be working out of Building Sedum, 3rd floor. They're expecting somebody." He handed her a temporary badge. "This'll get you through most doors. Anything classified, you'll need an escort." She took the badge, clipped it to her belt, and nodded once. "Thank you. You know where Building Sedum is? I'll find it." As she turned away, the petty officer watched her go, something nagging at the back of his mind. The way she carried herself. The way she'd said, "I'll find it," with the certainty of someone who already knew exactly where it was. He shook his head and went back to his screen. Probably just another senior contractor with a security clearance and an attitude. Outside, the base was waking up fully now. Jets screamed overhead on training runs, their afterburners painting white lines across the pale blue sky. Maintenance crews swarmed around aircraft on the flight line, their voices carrying across the tarmac. The smell of jet fuel mixed with salt air from the ocean just beyond the perimeter. She walked toward Building Sedum with the same unhurried pace, her eyes still taking in everything. The way crews moved around the aircraft, the maintenance schedules posted on digital boards near the hangars, the gaps in communication between ground crews and tower personnel that she could already see forming in the morning chaos. No one stopped her. No one saluted. No one even gave her a second glance. She was invisible here. Anonymous, exactly as she'd intended. Because the woman walking across that tarmac in civilian clothes, carrying a duffel bag and a temporary badge, wasn't a contractor, she wasn't a consultant. She wasn't even a mid-grade officer on a routine assignment. She was Captain Elena Vasquez, one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the history of the United States Navy. Call sign, Reaper, 3,000 flight hours, 2 combat deployments. The only pilot in the last decade to successfully land a crippled F.A. Oceana on a carrier deck, in a hurricane with hydraulics failing and no visibility. But none of that was written on her badge. None of that showed in her civilian clothes. And none of the people she passed that morning had any idea that the woman they were ignoring would, before the week was out, become the person every single one of them answered to. She reached Building Sedum, pulled open the glass door, and stepped inside. The real work was about to begin. The third floor of Building Sedum was a maze of narrow corridors and cramped offices that smelled like old carpet and recycled air. Voices echoed from behind half-closed doors, heated phone calls, frustrated briefings. The constant churn of a military bureaucracy trying to keep pace with reality. Elena found the office marked CAG Operations Support at the end of the hall. The door stood open. Inside, 3 officers hunched over a conference table covered in maps, flight schedules, and what looked like maintenance reports marked in angry red ink. She knocked lightly on the door frame. All 3 men looked up. The closest one, a lieutenant commander with dark circles under his eyes and coffee stains on his khaki uniform, straightened slightly. "Can we help you?" he asked, his tone polite but distracted. "Vasquez," Elena said simply. "Temporary assignment. I was told to report here." The lieutenant commander, his name tag read Morrison, frowned and shuffled through a stack of papers on his desk. "Vasquez. Yeah, okay. You're the systems analyst they sent from Norfolk, right?" Elena didn't correct him. She just nodded once. "Great," Morrison said, though his tone suggested it was anything but. "We've been waiting for someone who actually understands the new flight ops software. The contractors who installed it 3 months ago left us with a system that crashes every time we try to run a full squadron schedule." One of the other officers, a younger lieutenant, snorted. "Left us. With a disaster is more like it. Half the CAG staff can't even log in anymore." Elena set her duffel down near the wall and moved closer to the table, her eyes scanning the documents spread across it. Flight schedules, maintenance windows, fuel allocations, air traffic coordination, everything overlapping in a way that looked organized on paper but clearly wasn't working in practice. "What's the primary issue?" she asked quietly. Morrison sighed and pointed to a laptop showing a frozen screen filled with error codes. "That. The system's supposed to coordinate flight schedules with maintenance windows automatically, but instead, it's double-booking airspace, conflicting with tower clearances, and somehow managing to schedule aircraft that are still in pieces in the hangar." The third officer, a lieutenant with a sharp jaw and sharper tone, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. His name tag read Kellerman. "And before you ask," Kellerman said, his voice edged with sarcasm, "yes, we've tried turning it off and on again. We've tried every troubleshooting step in the manual. We've called the contractor hotline 6 times. They keep telling us it's user error." Elena's gaze moved to the error codes on the screen. She recognized the pattern immediately. A database synchronization failure caused by conflicting timestamp protocols between the flight ops system and the base's legacy maintenance tracking software. The contractors had built something sleek and modern without accounting for the 15-year-old infrastructure it had to interface with. "It's not user error," she said simply. Kellerman raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you can tell that just by looking?" "Yes." The room went quiet for half a second. Morrison cleared his throat. "Well, that's good," he said carefully. "So you think you can fix it?" Elena didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were still on the screen, tracing the error patterns, mapping the system architecture in her mind. She'd seen this exact failure before, not here, but on a carrier deployment 2 years ago, when a similar system had nearly grounded an entire strike group during a critical operation. "I'll need access to the back end," she said, "and the maintenance database logs from the past 3 months. Kellerman let out a short laugh. "You want back-end access on your first day? That requires clearance verification, supervisor approval, and about 6 forms that take a week to process." Elena finally looked at him directly. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes made him shift in his seat. "Then I suggest you start the paperwork now," she said quietly. "Because if this system goes down during flight ops tomorrow morning, the CAG is going to want to know why nobody prioritized fixing it." Morrison glanced between them, sensing the tension. "All right, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Vasquez, why don't you start by reviewing the system documentation? We've got a full binder here." "Somewhere, documentation won't help," Elena interrupted, her tone still calm but firm. "The problem isn't in the user manual. It's in how the system was configured during installation." Kellerman leaned forward now, his arms still crossed, his expression hardening. "And you know this because?" "Because I've fixed this exact issue before." "Where? Another base?" Elena paused. The truth was that she'd fixed it aboard the USS Ronald Reagan during a combat deployment in the South China Sea. But that information was classified, and more importantly, it wasn't something a systems analyst from Norfolk should know about. "I've worked with the system before," she said evenly. "That's why I was sent here." Kellerman's eyes narrowed. "Right. And I'm sure you've got a whole resume of credentials we've never heard of." "Lieutenant," Morrison said, his voice carrying a warning edge. But Kellerman wasn't done. He stood up, moving around the table to stand a few feet from Elena. He wasn't aggressive, exactly, but his posture made it clear he was testing her. "Look," he said, "no offense, but we've had 3 contractors in here already promising they could fix this. All of them had impressive credentials. All of them made it worse. So forgive me if I'm not jumping for joy just because Norfolk sent us another consultant who thinks she knows better than the people who actually fly these aircraft." The room went still. Elena didn't move, didn't react. Her expression remained calm, almost neutral. She'd heard variations of this speech 100 times before on carrier decks, in briefing rooms, from officers who assumed that anyone without visible rank couldn't possibly know what they were talking about. She could have ended it right there, could have told them exactly who she was. But that wasn't why she'd come here undercover. "I'm not here to make promises," she said quietly. "I'm here to fix what's broken. If you don't want the help, I'll go back to Norfolk and you can explain to the CAG why the flight schedule is still a mess next week." Morrison stepped in quickly. "Nobody's saying we don't want help. Kellerman, back off. She just got here." Kellerman held her gaze for another long moment, then shrugged and turned back to the table. "Fine. But when this blows up in our faces, I'm putting it in the report." Elena let the comment slide. She moved to an empty chair, pulled out a small notebook from her bag, and began writing down the error codes from the laptop screen. Her handwriting was small, precise, efficient. Morrison watched her for a moment, then sighed. "All right, I'll put in a request for your system access. Might take a day or 2. "That's fine," Elena said without looking up. As the 3 officers returned to their work, she continued taking notes, her pen moving steadily across the page. But she wasn't just writing down error codes. She was mapping the entire command structure of this office, noting who deferred to whom, who pushed back, who seemed competent, versus who was just exhausted. And she was remembering. Because Lieutenant Kellerman had just made a mistake that a lot of people made when they met her. He'd assumed that competence required volume, that authority required rank pins and ribbons. He'd dismissed her. And before this week was over, he would understand exactly how costly that assumption could be. The rest of that first day passed in a blur of paperwork, system diagnostics, and the kind of bureaucratic friction that defined military life. Elena worked quietly at a corner desk they'd cleared for her, her laptop open, her notebook filling with observations and technical notes. The office around her buzzed with controlled chaos. Phones rang constantly. Officers cycled through for briefings that ran too long and accomplished too little. Morrison spent half the afternoon on hold with IT support, trying to expedite Elena's system access. Kellerman made a point of ignoring her entirely. She didn't mind. Invisibility gave her something rank never could: the ability to see how things actually worked when no one was performing for the Admiral. Around Tijan-Sheshet hours, the door opened, and a man in his mid-40s stepped in, wearing a flight suit with captain's bars on the shoulders and a chest full of ribbons that told a story of decades in the cockpit. His name tag read Reeves. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set in the permanent expression of someone who'd been responsible for too many lives for too long. This was Captain Marcus Reeves, the CAG, the man in charge of every aircraft, every pilot, every mission on this base. Everyone in the room straightened immediately. "Afternoon, sir," Morrison said, standing. Reeves nodded, his eyes sweeping the office. "Status update on the flight ops system?" Morrison hesitated. "Still working through it, sir. We've got someone from Norfolk helping us troubleshoot." Reeves's gaze landed on Elena. "That her?" "Yes, sir. This is Vasquez," Elena said, standing. She didn't salute. Civilians didn't salute, but her posture shifted slightly, a subtle echo of military bearing that someone trained to notice such things might catch. Reeves studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You the systems analyst?" "I'm here to fix the scheduling software, sir." "Can you?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation, without qualification. Not, "I think so," or "I'll try." Just yes. Reeves's eyes narrowed slightly. "Morrison's been telling me for 3 months that this system is unfixable. You planning to prove him wrong?" Elena's expression didn't change. "The system's not unfixable, sir. It was just installed incorrectly." Kellerman, still seated at the conference table, let out a quiet scoff. Reeves's head turned sharply toward him. "Something to add, Lieutenant?" "No, sir," Kellerman said quickly. Reeves looked back at Elena. "How long?" "To diagnose?" "A few hours once I have access." "To fix?" "Depends on how deep the configuration and errors go. I need it operational by Friday. We've got a readiness inspection next week, and if my flight schedules look like amateur hour, someone's career is going to suffer for it." "Understood." Reeves studied her for another long moment, then nodded curtly. "Keep me posted." He turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The room exhaled collectively. Morrison wiped a hand across his face. "Well, you just committed us to fixing this in 72 hours. Elena sat back down. "It won't take that long." Kellerman finally spoke up, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You sound pretty confident for someone who hasn't even logged into the system yet." She didn't look at him. "Confidence comes from experience. And you've got plenty of that, I'm sure." "Enough." The conversation died there. Elena went back to her notes, and the room settled into an uneasy quiet. An hour later, Morrison left to deal with another crisis in the maintenance hangar. Kellerman followed shortly after, muttering something about needing to brief the squadron commanders. That left Elena alone with the youngest officer in the room, a fresh-faced lieutenant junior grade, named Parker, who'd been working quietly at his desk all day. Parker glanced over at her, hesitated, then spoke. "You really think you can fix it?" Elena looked up. "The software?" "Yes. Everyone else who's tried made it worse." "That's because they didn't understand what was actually broken." Parker nodded slowly, still uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "You said you've worked with this system before. Where was that?" Elena paused. This was the question she'd been expecting since she walked in, the question that could unravel her cover if she answered wrong. "Different base," she said carefully. "Similar setup." "Which base?" She met his eyes directly. "I'm not at liberty to discuss previous assignments." That was the truth. Most of her previous assignments were classified. But the way she said it, calm, matter of fact, without defensiveness, planted a seed of doubt in Parker's mind. Who was this woman really? Before he could ask another question, Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then stood. "I need to make a call. I'll be back in 10 minutes. She stepped into the hallway, walking until she found an empty stairwell. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. It was answered on the first ring. Vasquez. The voice on the other end belonged to Admiral Patricia Grayson, commander of Naval Air Forces Atlantic, one of the most powerful officers in the Navy, and one of the few people who knew exactly what Elena was doing at Oceana. "Ma'am," Elena said quietly, "Day 1 complete. They've bought the cover. Any resistance?" "Some. Nothing unexpected. The CAG wants results by Friday. Can you deliver?" Elena's voice was steady. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Remember, the point of this exercise isn't just to fix their hat-on systems. It's to see how they function when they think no one important is watching. I need to know if this command is ready for the operational tempo we're about to throw at them." "Understood. And Vasquez?" "Ma'am, keep your head down. I know it goes against every instinct you have, but if they figure out who you are before you're ready to reveal it, we lose the value of this entire evaluation. I won't compromise the mission." "Ma'am, I know you won't. That's why I picked you." The line went dead. Elena stood in the stairwell for a moment, phone still in her hand, staring at the concrete wall in front of her. This wasn't the first time she'd operated undercover, but it never got easier. Letting people underestimate her. Hearing their doubts, their dismissals, their casual disrespect. But she'd learned long ago that the best way to understand a command was to see it from the bottom, not the top. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned to the office. That evening, as the base began to wind down, Elena sat alone at her desk, her laptop screen glowing in the dimming light. She'd finally received temporary system access, limited, monitored, but enough to start mapping the problem. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced speed, pulling up database logs, configuration files, system architecture diagrams. Lines of code scrolled past, each one telling part of the story. As she'd suspected, the contractors who'd installed the software had made a critical error. They'd configured the flight ops system to use Greenwich Mean Time for all timestamps, while the base's legacy maintenance system used local time. Every time the two systems tried to sync, the timestamps conflicted, causing the entire coordination protocol to collapse. It was such a simple mistake. But it was the kind of mistake that only someone with deep operational experience would recognize, because it wasn't about the code, it was about understanding how carrier operations actually worked. Where pilots briefed at Shterista local but logged flight hours in Zulu time, and maintenance crews tracked everything in their own time zone. She'd seen this exact failure before, fixed it before, and now she would fix it again. But as she worked, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She glanced up to see Kellerman standing in the doorway, jacket on, keys in hand, clearly about to leave for the night. He saw her still working and paused. "You're here late," he said, his tone neutral now. Some of the earlier hostility faded. "I wanted to get started," Elena replied. Kellerman stepped into the office, moving closer to her desk. He glanced at her screen, at the code and diagrams that probably looked like gibberish to him. "Can I ask you something?" he said after a moment. "Sure. Why do you care?" Elena looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're a contractor. You're getting paid whether this system works or not. Why stay late? Why push so hard?" For the first time since she'd arrived, Elena let a small, genuine smile touch her lips. "Because when this system fails," she said quietly, "pilots don't get the flight schedules they need. Maintenance doesn't happen on time. Aircraft sit on the ground when they should be in the air. And eventually, someone doesn't come home because a mission got delayed, or a maintenance check got missed." Kellerman stared at her. "You talk like you've seen that happen." Elena's smile faded. "I have." "Where?" She held his gaze. "Places I can't talk about." Something shifted in Kellerman's expression. The skepticism didn't disappear entirely, but it softened, replaced by something closer to curiosity. "Who are you, really?" he asked. Elena turned back to her screen. "Someone who's trying to help." Kellerman stood there for another moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Well, thanks for staying. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when it works." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." As he walked out, Elena let out a thank, slow breath. The first crack had formed. Not in the system in the wall of dismissal that had greeted her arrival, but the real test was still coming. Because fixing software was easy. Facing the moment when they realized who she actually was? That would be something else entirely. The alarm didn't scream. It didn't have to. At 5:30 hours on Wednesday morning, the base was already awake, flight crews prepping for dawn sorties, maintenance teams running final checks, the tower coordinating the intricate dance of aircraft, fuel trucks, and personnel that kept a naval air station operational. Elena had been awake since Charista. She'd arrived at Building Sedum before the sun broke the horizon. Her laptop already open, coffee steaming beside her keyboard. She'd made significant progress on the flight ops system overnight, working from her temporary quarters until her eyes burned. The timestamp conflict was fixable, but the deeper she dug, the more secondary issues she found, cascading errors that the contractors had papered over rather than resolved. She was 3 layers deep into a database query when the first indication of trouble appeared. A single red warning icon popped up in the corner of her screen. System synchronization failure. She frowned, clicked it open, and felt her stomach tighten. The flight ops system had just attempted to push the morning's flight schedule to the tower, and the data transfer had corrupted mid-process. Instead of receiving clean scheduling data, the tower's system now showed aircraft assignments overlapping, fuel windows conflicting, and most critically, 2 different F/A-18 Super Hornets scheduled to use the same runway at the same time. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the system logs. The corruption had propagated through 3 connected databases in the span of 90 seconds. And worse, the system's automated backup had failed to catch it because the backup itself was using the same flawed timestamp protocol. She grabbed her phone and dialed Morrison's cell. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep. "Morrison, it's Vasquez. We have a problem." She heard him sit up, suddenly alert. "What kind of problem?" "The flight ops system just pushed corrupted data to the tower. If they try to run this morning's schedule as is, you're going to have aircraft conflicts across the board." There was a pause. How bad? Bad enough that someone could end up in the wrong airspace at the wrong time, or 2 aircraft could be cleared for the same runway. Jesus. She heard rustling in the background, the sound of him grabbing clothes. "I'm 10 minutes out." "Can you contain it?" "I can flag the errors, but I don't have authorization to push corrections directly to the tower system. Someone with command authority needs to make that call. I'll call the CAG. Sit tight." The line went dead. Elena saved her work and stood, moving to the window that overlooked the flight line. In the growing dawnlight, she could see the first crews arriving at their aircraft. Pilots doing walkarounds, maintenance chiefs checking off final items. Everything moving with the practiced efficiency of a system that believed it was operating on good data. Her jaw tightened. She pulled out her phone again and made a different call. This one went through a secure line that bypassed the base switchboard entirely. "Grayson." "Ma'am, we have a situation." Elena explained quickly, precisely. Admiral Grayson listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, there was a long silence. "Can you fix it?" Grayson asked. "Yes, ma'am. But not through official channels. Not in time." "Then fix it unofficially." "Ma'am, that means bypassing the chain of command. If I do that, it could blow my cover. If you don't do it, aircraft could collide, which is worse." Elena closed her eyes. "Understood. I'll smooth things over from my end if it comes to that. But Vasquez, make sure you're right about this. If you shut down morning flight ops and you're wrong, there won't be enough political cover in the world to protect you." "I'm not wrong, ma'am." "Then do what needs to be done." The line went dead. Elena stood there for 3 seconds, running through her options. Then she grabbed her laptop, her phone, and headed for the door. The tower control room sat at the top of a 7-story structure that dominated the eastern edge of the base. From its windows, controllers had a clear view of every runway, taxiway, and approach path. It was the nerve center of flight operations, and under normal circumstances, it was off-limits to anyone without specific authorization. Elena arrived at the base of the tower at 5:30 hours. A Marine sergeant stood guard at the entrance, his McTierry rifle held at a relaxed but ready position. "Ma'am," he said politely, but firmly, "this area is restricted." Elena held up her badge. "I need to speak with the tower supervisor. Emergency." The sergeant glanced at her badge, then at her civilian clothes. "You're not authorized for tower access. I know. But the flight scheduling system just failed, and if someone doesn't correct it in the next 10 minutes, you're going to have aircraft conflicts." His expression shifted from polite to concerned. "Did you contact the CAG's office?" "They're on their way, but the CAG is 15 minutes out, and the first flight is scheduled to taxi in 8 minutes. The sergeant hesitated. Protocol said no unauthorized personnel. But protocol also said preventing aircraft accidents took priority over access restrictions. He keyed his radio. "Tower. This is Gate 7. I've got a civilian analyst here claiming there's a scheduling emergency. She's requesting access to speak with the supervisor." A moment later, a voice crackled back. "Send her up. I'll meet her at the door." The sergeant nodded to Elena. "7th floor. Elevators inside." "Thank you, Sergeant." She moved quickly through the building's lower level, found the elevator, and jabbed the button for the top floor. The ride felt like it took forever, the ancient elevator creaking and groaning as it climbed. When the doors opened, she found herself facing a Navy lieutenant commander with tired eyes and a coffee mug in his hand. His name tag read, "Chen." "You the one who says we've got a scheduling problem?" he asked. "Yes, sir. The flight ops system corrupted this morning's data push. Your current schedule shows conflicts that could cause—" "I know," Chen interrupted, his voice tight. "We caught them about 3 minutes ago when we started cross-checking against yesterday's prep work. We've been trying to reach the CAG's office, but no one's answering. They know. They're on their way." Chen looked at her more carefully now. "Who are you?" "Systems analyst. I'm working on fixing the flight ops software. Well, unless you can fix it in the next 5 minutes, we're going to have to ground everything until we manually rebuild the schedule, which means delays, missed training windows, and a very angry CAG." Elena's mind raced. The tower system and the flight ops system were separate but connected. If she could access the tower's database directly, she could manually correct the corrupted entries. But that required administrator credentials she didn't have. Unless— "Sir, do you have the maintenance override codes for the tower system?" Chen frowned. "The override codes are for emergency use only. This is an emergency. Those codes bypass all the safety protocols. If we use them wrong—" "I know what they do," Elena said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of command that made Chen pause. "And I know how to use them. I've done this before." Chen stared at her. "Where?" Elena held his gaze. "On a carrier. During a combat deployment. When the entire air operations schedule failed 30 minutes before a strike launch. The tower control room had gone quiet. Other controllers were listening now, their pad. Attention split between their screens and this civilian woman who was speaking with a confidence that didn't match her appearance. Chen made a decision. "If I give you those codes and you make things worse, my career is over. If you don't give me those codes and aircraft conflict on the runway, careers won't matter." He studied her for 3 more seconds. Then he moved to a locked cabinet on the wall, pulled out a key, and opened it. Inside was a laminated card with a long string of alphanumeric codes. He handed it to her. "You've got 5 minutes. After that, I'm pulling you out whether you're done or not." "Understood." Chen led her to an empty workstation. Elena sat down, her fingers already moving before he'd finished logging her in. She entered the override codes, bypassing 3 layers of security, and pulled up the raw database. The corrupted data was immediately visible timestamps out of sequence, aircraft assignments duplicated, fuel windows overlapping in ways that violated physics. It would have taken the tower crew hours to manually identify and fix everything. Elena had done this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. Her fingers moved with practiced speed, executing commands that most software engineers would need reference manuals to remember. She isolated the corrupted entries, cross-referenced them against the backup data from 12 hours earlier, and began rebuilding the schedule piece by piece. Behind her, Chen watched the screen, his expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to awe. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked quietly. Elena didn't look up. "Experience. That's not just experience. That's—" A new alarm sounded. Not from the scheduling system, From the radio. Tower. This is Hornet 213. Ready to taxi. Chen moved quickly to the controller's station. 213. Stand by. We're experiencing a system delay. Tower. We're on a tight schedule. What's the delay? Chen glanced at Elena. She was still working. Her eyes locked on the screen. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air conditioning. 213, we'll have you cleared shortly. Stand by. Roger, standing by. The seconds ticked past. Elena's fingers never stopped moving. She corrected the last corrupted entry, cross-checked the entire schedule against safety protocols, and then finally pushed the corrected data to the live system. The screens around the room flickered once, then updated. Clean data, no conflicts. Everything aligned. Chen leaned over her shoulder, scanning the results. His eyes widened. That's perfect. Elena stood, her legs slightly unsteady. It should hold for today's operations, but you need to run a full system diagnostic before tomorrow's schedule pushes, or this could happen again. Chen was still staring at the screen. Who are you? Before Elena could answer, the elevator doors opened again. Captain Reeves strode out, Morrison right behind him, both of them, looking like they'd dressed in the dark and run the entire way from the parking lot. Report, Reeves barked. Chen turned. Sir, we had a catastrophic scheduling failure. Corrupted data pushed from the flight ops system. Multiple conflicts. We were about to ground all morning flights. Reeves's face darkened. And? This woman fixed it. Chen gestured to Elena. In 5 minutes. By hand. I've never seen anything like it. Reeves's gaze swung to Elena. His expression was unreadable. Vasquez, sir. You bypassed security protocols. Yes, sir. It was necessary. You accessed tower systems without proper authorization. Yes, sir. Reeves stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level that only she could hear. You just prevented what could have been the worst disaster this base has seen in a decade. And you did it like you've done it 100 times before. Elena said nothing. Reeves studied her face, his eyes searching for something. Where did you serve? The question hung in the patter. Air. Everyone in the tower was listening now. Elena met his gaze steadily. I can't discuss previous assignments, sir. Can't or won't. Both. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Reeves nodded once, slowly, as if a piece of a puzzle had just clicked into place in his mind. Morrison, he said, not looking away from Elena. I want a full report on what happened here, and I want to know everything about Ms. Vasquez's background that you can dig up. Yes, sir. Reeves turned back to Chen. Resume normal operations. And Chen? Sir? Whatever this woman asks for from now on, she gets. Understood? Yes, sir. Reeves walked back to the elevator, Morrison trailing behind. As the doors closed, Morrison glanced back at Elena, his expression a mixture of confusion and something that might have been respect. The tower crew slowly returned to their stations, but Elena could feel their eyes on her. The whispers had already started. Chen approached her quietly. You want to tell me what's really going on? Elena gathered her laptop. I'm just here to fix the software. No, Chen said firmly. You're not. People who are just here to fix software don't move like you move. They don't talk like you talk. And they sure as hell don't know carrier air ops emergency procedures by heart. Elena didn't respond. She just headed for the elevator. Behind her, Chen called out. Whoever you are, thank you. You saved lives today. Elena paused at the elevator doors, her hand on the button. Without turning around, she said quietly, just doing my job. The doors closed, and she was gone. By Ocean's hours, the story had spread through the base like wildfire. In the pilot briefing room, a group of F.A. Oceanastia aviators sat around a table, covered in flight charts and coffee cups. The squadron commander, Commander Jaws Hawkins, was holding court. I'm telling you. Chen said she fixed the entire schedule in 5 minutes. By hand. Like she was playing a video game. One of the younger pilots, Lieutenant Spike Rodriguez, frowned. Who is she? Some contractor Norfolk sent. Systems analyst or something. Contractors don't know carrier air ops procedures. This one does. Jaws leaned back in his chair. Chen said she bypassed security protocols he didn't even know existed, and when Reeves asked her where she served, she stonewalled him. Another pilot, Lieutenant Commander Torch Brennan, spoke up. "Wait," she said, "served? Like military served?" That's what Chen heard. Spike shook his head. "Doesn't make sense. If she's prior service, her records would show it. And if she's got that kind of operational experience, why is she pretending to be a contractor?" No one had an answer for that. In the maintenance hangar, a different conversation was taking place. Staff Sergeant Luis Vega was briefing his team on the morning's close call. If that schedule had gone through, we would have had 2 birds on the same runway at the same time. You know what happens then? His team knew. They'd all seen the training videos. Aircraft collisions on the ground were rare, but when they happened, people died. So who stopped it? One of the younger mechanics asked. New contractor, civilian woman. She walked into the tower and fixed the whole thing before anyone knew what was happening. How? Vega shrugged. Beats me. But Chief Chen said she moved through that system like she'd designed it herself. Later that morning, Elena returned to Building 7. The office was crowded. Now word of the near disaster had brought everyone in early. Morrison was on the phone with IT security, trying to explain how and why a contractor had been given emergency override codes. Kellerman stood near the window, arms crossed, staring at nothing. When Elena walked in, the room went quiet. Morrison hung up the phone. "Vasquez, my office. Now." She followed him into the small side office he used for private conversations. He closed the door and turned to face her. "I just spent 30 minutes explaining to the security officer why you had access to systems you shouldn't have touched. Do you want to tell me what the hell happened this morning?" Elena set her laptop down. "The flight ops system pushed corrupted data. I fixed it." "You did more than fix it. You accessed classified systems. You bypassed security protocols. You gave orders to tower personnel like you were—" He stopped himself, his eyes narrowing. "Like I was what?" Elena asked quietly. Morrison studied her face. "Like you were in command." Elena said nothing. Morrison sat down heavily in his chair. "Who are you, really?" "I told you. I'm here to fix the software." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I can give right now." Morrison rubbed his face with both hands. "You know what's going to happen now, right? The CAG is going to dig into your background. Security is going to run every check they can. If there's something you're hiding—" "I'm not hiding anything," Elena said. "My credentials are legitimate. My background checks are clean. Everything about my assignment here is authorized at the highest levels." "Then, why won't you tell us where you served?" Elena met his eyes. "Because that's not why I'm here." Before Morrison could respond, there was a knock on the door. Kellerman stuck his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here asking for Vasquez." Morrison frowned. "Who?" "He wouldn't say. Just that it's urgent." Elena and Morrison returned to the main office. Standing near the entrance was a man in his late 50s, wearing a Navy captain's uniform and the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd spent a career in the cockpit. His chest was covered in ribbons, including the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Navy Cross. His name tag read Cortez. Elena recognized him immediately. Captain Miguel Cortez, one of the most legendary fighter pilots in the Navy. He'd flown combat missions in 3 different wars and had once landed an F-14 on a carrier with one engine on fire and the other failing. He was also one of the few people on this base who might recognize her. Cortez's eyes locked on Elena. For a long moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, very quietly, he said, "Reaper." The room went dead silent. Morrison's head snapped toward Elena. "What did he just call you?" Elena's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Cortez stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "It is you. I knew it the second I heard the story about the tower. Only one person I've ever seen who could fix a corrupted air ops schedule that fast." Kellerman pushed away from the wall. "Wait. Reaper? As in Captain Elena Vasquez," Cortez said, his voice carrying a weight of respect that silenced everyone. "Call sign Reaper. 3,000 flight hours. 2 combat deployments. The pilot who landed a crippled Hornet on the Reagan in a hurricane with no hydraulics and zero visibility. Morrison's face had gone pale. That was you? Elena closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. Captain Cortez. Don't, Cortez said, holding up a hand. Whatever you're doing here, whoever authorized this, I'm not going to blow it. But these people deserve to know who just saved their lives this morning. He turned to address the room. This woman isn't a contractor. She's one of the finest aviators I've ever had the privilege of serving with. If she fixed your systems this morning, it's because she's forgotten more about flight operations than most of us will ever learn. Kellerman's voice was barely above a whisper. You're a pilot? Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I was. Was? She didn't answer that. Instead, she turned to Morrison. I need to speak with Captain Reeves. Now. Morrison nodded slowly, still processing. I'll make the call. As Elena walked toward the door, Cortez fell into step beside her. He spoke low, just for her ears. How bad did it hurt? Losing your wings? Elena's step faltered. For just a fraction of a second. How did you know? Because you said, was. And because I know what happened after the Reagan deployment. The medical board. The grounding. Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. I don't want to talk about it. I know. But Elena, these people are going to find out. And when they do, they need to understand that just because you can't fly anymore doesn't mean you stopped being one of us. She stopped walking and looked at him. Really looked at him. Why are you here, Miguel? Because I heard a story about a civilian who prevented a disaster this morning, and I had a feeling. So I came to see if I was right. He smiled sadly. I was hoping I wasn't. Why? Because if you're here undercover, it means something bigger is going on. And if something bigger is going on, it means this base has problems I haven't seen yet. Elena nodded slowly. You're not wrong. Cortez squeezed her shoulder once. Whatever you need, Reaper. You've got my support. Thank you. As he walked away, Elena stood alone in the hallway, her cover slowly unraveling around her, and the weight of old memories pressing down on her shoulders. Because Captain Cortez was right about one thing. She wasn't just here to fix software. She was here because Admiral Grayson suspected that NAS Oceana had deeper problems than scheduling conflicts and corrupted databases. Problems that required someone who could see the base from the inside, without the distortion that rank and position created. And now, less than 72 hours into her assignment, her identity was leaking out piece by piece. The question wasn't whether they would discover who she was. The question was what they would do when they realized why she was really here. Captain Reeves's office was on the second floor of the headquarters building, a corner space with windows that looked out over the flight line. When Elena arrived, escorted by Morrison, Reeves was standing at one of those windows, hands clasped behind his back, watching a pair of F.A. Oshimnashi's taxi toward the runway. Sir, Morrison said from the doorway. Vasquez is here. Reeves didn't turn around. Come in. Close the door. Elena stepped inside. Morrison hesitated, then followed, shutting the door behind them. The office was spare a desk, a few chairs, and walls covered with photographs of aircraft and crews from decades of service. Reeves finally turned around. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. I just got off the phone with Captain Cortez, he said. He told me an interesting story about you. Elena said nothing. He says your call sign is Reaper, that you're one of the best aviators he's ever flown with, that you saved an entire strike group once by landing an aircraft that should have gone into the ocean. Morrison's eyes widened. He looked at Elena like he was seeing her for the first time. Reeves continued. So I pulled your personnel file, the one Norfolk sent when they assigned you here. He picked up a folder from his desk. It says you're a systems analyst with a specialty in military software integration. It says you have a background in IT and logistics. It says absolutely nothing about you being a pilot. He dropped the folder back on the desk. Which means, Reeves said slowly, either Captain Cortez is mistaken, which I doubt, or someone very high up the chain of command decided to send me a ringer without telling me who I was actually getting. Elena met his gaze steadily. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details of my assignment, sir. Not at liberty, that's an interesting phrase. That's the kind of phrase someone uses when they're operating under orders they can't reveal. He stepped closer. So let me ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Are you really here to fix our scheduling software, or is that just cover for something else? Elena took a slow breath. This was the moment. She could continue the charade, stick to her cover story, and hope it held long enough to complete her evaluation. Or she could trust that Reeves was smart enough and secure enough to handle the truth. She chose the latter. Both, she said quietly. Reeves nodded once, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. Who sent you? I can't say. Can't or won't. Sir, with respect, if I tell you who authorized this assignment, it compromises the integrity of what I'm here to do. Morrison stepped forward. What are you here to do? Elena turned to him. Evaluate whether this command is ready for the operational tempo that's coming. What operational tempo? Morrison demanded. Reeves held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes never left Elena's face. How bad is it? Bad enough that someone at Airlant decided they needed eyes on the ground without the filter of rank and protocol. Airlant. Commander, Naval Air Forces Atlantic. Admiral Grayson's command. Reeves absorbed that. So this whole week the software, issues, the scheduling failures, the tower emergency, you've been watching how we respond. Yes, sir. Testing us. Observing. There's a difference. And what have you observed? Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. I've observed a command with good people who are stretched too thin. I've observed systems that have been patched together instead of properly fixed. I've observed leaders who are more focused on looking ready than actually being ready. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Morrison's face flushed. That's not fair. We've been dealing with budget cuts, personnel shortages, aging equipment. I know, Elena said, her tone softening slightly. And I'm not saying anyone here is failing. I'm saying the system is failing you, and someone needs to document that before it leads to casualties. Reeves walked back to the window, his jaw working. After a long moment, he spoke. If I'd known who you were, I would have handled things differently this week. That's exactly why you didn't know. He turned back to her. Are you going to tell me who you really are? Your actual rank? Your actual position? Elena hesitated. Then she pulled out her phone, scrolled to a contact, and held it out to him. Call this number. It'll explain everything. Reeves took the phone and read the contact name. His eyebrows rose. This is, yes sir, he dialed. The call was answered immediately. Reeves listened for perhaps 30 seconds, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was formal. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. There won't be a problem. Thank you for clarifying. He ended the call and handed the phone back to Elena. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, very deliberately, he came to attention and saluted. Morrison's jaw dropped. Sir. What, Commander Morrison? Reeves said, his voice carrying the full weight of command. You are, looking at Captain Elena Vasquez, naval aviator, call sign Reaper, currently serving on special assignment to Airlant. She is here with the full authority of Admiral Grayson to evaluate our operational readiness. Everything she observes, everything she reports, will go directly to the Admiral's desk. Morrison's face had gone from flushed to pale. He stammered, we. Sir, if we'd known. If you'd known, you would have put on a show, Elena said quietly. And Admiral Grayson would have gotten a sanitized version of reality instead of the truth. Reeves lowered his salute. What do you need from me? Complete access, no restrictions, and no special treatment. I need to see this base as it actually operates, not as it performs for inspections. You'll have it. And sir, the people in your command, Morrison, Kellerman, the tower crew, the maintenance teams, they don't need to know the details. Let them think I'm a consultant who's here to help fix problems. The less they perform for me, the more accurate my assessment will be. Reeves nodded slowly. Agreed. But Vasquez, sir? When this is over, when you've written your report and moved on, these people are still going to be here. They're still going to be dealing with the same problems. So, whatever you put in that report, make sure it actually helps them. Not just the brass in Washington. Elena met his eyes. That's exactly what I intend to do, sir. Reeves studied her for another moment, then nodded. All right, Morrison, you heard her. Captain Vasquez gets whatever she needs. And we don't discuss this conversation outside this room. Yes, sir, Morrison said, though he still looked shell-shocked. As Elena turned to leave, Reeves spoke again. Captain? She paused. Cortez said you lost your wings. Medical grounding? Elena's hand tightened on the doorframe. Yes, sir. But you're still here. Still serving. Yes, sir. That takes a different kind of courage. Elena didn't trust herself to respond to that. She just nodded once and walked out. In the hallway, Morrison caught up with her. His earlier skepticism had been replaced by something more complicated: respect mixed with embarrassment. I owe you an apology, he said. You don't. I do. We all do. We treated you like someone who hadn't earned your respect yet, Elena finished, which was accurate. I hadn't, not as far as you knew. Still, if I'd known who you were, Morrison. She stopped walking and faced him. If you'd known who I was, you would have been on your best behavior. You would have hidden problems instead of letting me see them. And I wouldn't have been able to do my job. He nodded slowly. What happens now? Now, I finish fixing your scheduling software. I continue observing. And at the end of this assignment, I write a report that either says this command is ready for what's coming, or that it needs significant support and resources. And which way is that report going to go? Elena considered the question. That depends on the next few days. On whether the people here show me they're capable of handling the truth when it's uncomfortable. On whether leadership is willing to make hard decisions instead of easy ones. Morrison absorbed that. For what it's worth, you've already proven something this week. What's that? That maybe we needed someone to come in and shake things up, even if we didn't know we needed it. Elena almost smiled. We'll see if you still feel that way when this is over. As she walked back toward Building Sedum, she felt the weight of the morning settling on her shoulders. Her cover was compromised. Key personnel now knew who she was, and the careful observation she'd been conducting was about to shift into something more direct, but there was also relief, because operating undercover, letting people underestimate her, hearing their dismissals and doubts, it had taken a toll she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. At least some of them knew the truth now. The question was whether the rest of the base was ready to know it too, and more importantly, whether they were ready for what that truth meant about their own readiness or lack thereof. By Thursday afternoon, the whispers had become a roar. Captain Miguel Cortez's visit hadn't gone unnoticed. Word spread through the squadrons, the maintenance hangars, the mess halls. Someone important had come specifically to see the civilian contractor. Someone had called her by a call sign. Someone had treated her with the kind of respect reserved for aviators who'd earned their place in Navy legend. The rumors multiplied with each retelling. She was former Special Operations. She was an intelligence officer working undercover. She was a test pilot who'd survived a crash that should have killed her. Each story was more dramatic than the last, but they all shared one common thread. The quiet woman in civilian clothes was not who she appeared to be. Lieutenant Kellerman heard the stories in the squadron ready room that afternoon. He was sitting alone, reviewing flight plans, when two of the senior pilots walked in, their conversation already in progress. Chen swears she knew carrier air ops procedures better than anyone he'd ever seen, one was saying. And Cortez called her Reaper. That's not a nickname you get from fixing computers. The other pilot, a lieutenant commander with 15 years in the cockpit, shook his head in disbelief. If she's really who Cortez thinks she is, then we've got a genuine legend walking around this base, and we've been treating her like she's nobody. Kellerman's stomach tightened. He thought back to his first interaction with Elena, the dismissive tone he'd used, the way he'd questioned her competence, the sarcasm about her credentials. You sound pretty confident for someone who hasn't even logged into the system yet. He'd said that to her, to someone who might be one of the most accomplished aviators in the Navy. He stood abruptly and left the ready room, his flight plans forgotten. In Building Sedum, Elena worked at her desk as if nothing had changed. Her laptop screen glowed with lines of code, her notebook filled with observations and technical notes. She'd made significant progress on the flight ops system. The core timestamp conflict was resolved, and she was now addressing the cascade of secondary issues that had been hidden beneath it. But the office around her had changed. The casual dismissals were gone. The jokes had stopped. When people spoke to her now, their voices carried a different quality, not quite deference, but something closer to cautious respect. Morrison had kept his word. He hadn't told anyone the full details of her identity. But he also hadn't been able to completely contain the speculation, and the rumors were filling in the gaps with their own versions of the truth. Around Tijan's pinset hours, the door opened and a group of 5 enlisted sailors walked in. They wore working uniforms, grease-stained and rumpled from a long day in the maintenance hangars. The one in front, a petty officer first class with a weathered face and calloused hands, approached Elena's desk. "Ma'am," he said, his voice formal but uncertain, "we heard, that is, some of us heard that you might be. That you used to fly." Elena looked up from her laptop. "I did." The petty officer shifted his weight. "Hornets?" "Among other things." Another sailor, younger, spoke up. "Were you on the Reagan? During the deployment in 23?" Elena's hands stilled on the keyboard. That deployment. The one where everything had changed. The one where she'd proven she could handle anything the Navy threw at her, and then proven she couldn't handle what came after. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was." The sailors exchanged glances. The first petty officer spoke again, his voice softer now. "Ma'am, I was on that deployment. Aviation ordnance. I was on the flight deck the night you brought that Hornet in, during the storm." Elena's chest tightened. She remembered that night in fragments, the way the aircraft had shuddered and bucked, fighting her for every inch of control. The way the carrier deck had appeared and disappeared in the sheets of rain. The way the landing signal officer's voice had crackled through her headset, barely audible over the storm and the screaming alarms. She remembered the impact when she'd hit the deck. The way the tailhook had caught the wire at the last possible second. The way she'd sat in the cockpit afterward, hands shaking so badly she couldn't unbuckle her harness. "That was a long time ago," she said. "No, ma'am." The petty officer's voice was firm. "That was legendary. I watched you line up that approach with hydraulics failing and the deck pitching 20 degrees. I watched you bring that bird in like you'd done it 1,000 times. And when you climbed out of the cockpit, you looked at us and asked if the aircraft could be saved." He paused. "You didn't ask if you were okay. You asked about the bird." Elena didn't know what to say to that. The younger sailor spoke again. "Is it true you got grounded after that deployment?" The question hung in the air. Elena could feel the weight of their attention, the way they were waiting for her answer. These weren't officers playing political games. These were enlisted sailors who understood what it meant to give everything to the job and have the job take something back. "Yes," she said finally. "Medical grounding. Permanent." "But you're still here," the petty officer said. It wasn't a question. "I'm still here." He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something important. Then, very deliberately, he came to attention. His right hand rose in a sharp, perfect salute. "Ma'am, it's an honor." The other sailors followed immediately, their hands snapping up in unison. Elena stood slowly, her throat tight. She returned the salute, holding it for a long moment before lowering her hand. "The honor is mine," she said quietly. "You're the ones who keep the aircraft flying. We just get to be the ones in the seat." The petty officer smiled a small, genuine expression. "Still, ma'am, it means something to know you're here. That you didn't give up even after." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. As the sailors filed out, Elena sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. She'd been saluted thousands of times in her career. But this one felt different. These sailors hadn't saluted her rank or her position. They'd saluted what she'd survived. And that carried a weight she hadn't expected. By evening, the word had spread to every corner of the base. In the enlisted mess hall, sailors who'd only seen Elena in passing now spoke her name with reverence. In the officers' club, pilots who'd dismissed her as a contractor now traded stories they'd heard about her flying. In the maintenance hangars, crews who'd never met her knew exactly who she was. Captain Elena Vasquez. Call sign Reaper. The pilot who'd done the impossible and paid the price for it. At Tijan's Ocean set hours, Morrison found Elena still working in the now empty office. He knocked on the doorframe even though the door was open. "You're here late," he said. "Almost done," Elena replied, not looking up from her screen. "The system should be stable for tomorrow's operations. After that, you'll need to run a full diagnostic to make sure there aren't any other hidden issues." Morrison stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I wanted to apologize." "You already did." "No, I mean for what's happening out there." He gestured vaguely toward the base beyond the walls. "The rumors. The stories. People are treating you like you're some kind of ghost from the past." Elena finally looked up. "That's what I am, though. A ghost. Someone who used to fly and now doesn't." "That's not Morrison, it's fine. I knew this would happen once my cover broke. It's part of the process." "What process?" Elena closed her laptop. "The process of them seeing me as I actually am instead of who they assumed I was. The process of them realizing that competence doesn't always come with the credentials they expect. The process of learning that sometimes the most important evaluations happen when you don't know you're being evaluated." Morrison absorbed that. "So all of this, the undercover assignment, the civilian clothes, the way you let us treat you, it was all part of testing us?" "Not testing, observing. There's a difference. Feels like a test we failed." Elena stood and gathered her things. "You didn't fail, Morrison. Your systems failed. Your protocols failed. But the people? The people showed up. They did their jobs. They tried to make broken things work, even when the system wasn't supporting them." She paused. "That's what my report is going to say. That this base needs resources, not reprimands. Support, not sanctions." Morrison's expression shifted to something closer, to relief. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank your people. They're the reason this place is still functioning despite everything working against them." As she walked toward the door, Morrison spoke again. "Captain Vasquez?" She turned. "What you did this morning. Preventing that disaster in the tower, that wasn't part of your observation mission, was it? That was you being unable to stand by and watch people get hurt." Elena held his gaze. "Someone once told me that the hardest part of being grounded isn't losing the ability to fly. It's losing the ability to directly prevent the kinds of accidents you've spent your career training to avoid." "Who told you that?" "Someone who understood what it means to lose something you can never get back." She left before he could ask anything else. Outside, the base had settled into its evening rhythm. Jets sat silent on the flight line, their canopies covered, their weapons stations empty. Security lights cast long shadows across the tarmac. The ocean breeze carried the smell of salt and fuel. Elena walked alone toward her temporary quarters, her duffel bag over her shoulder, her mind running through everything she'd observed over the past 4 days. She'd come here to evaluate whether NAS Oceana was ready for increased operational tempo, whether the command structure was solid, whether the systems were reliable, whether the people could handle the pressure. What she'd found was more complicated than a simple pass or fail. The systems were broken, that much was clear. The flight ops software was a disaster. The maintenance tracking was inadequate. The communication protocols were outdated. But the people? The people were doing everything they could with what they had. And that mattered. Her phone buzzed. A message from Admiral Grayson. "Heard your cover is compromised." "Status?" Elena typed back quickly. "Partial. Key personnel no. Evaluation continues. No mission compromise." The response came seconds later. "Good. Finish the job." "And Vasquez, I'm hearing stories about a tower emergency. Tell me you didn't blow your cover just to prevent an accident." Elena smiled slightly as she typed. "Would that be a problem, ma'am?" "Only if you're asking for forgiveness instead of permission." "Noted. When this is over, we'll talk about your next assignment. You're too good at this to waste on just one evaluation." Elena stared at that message for a long time before responding. "Yes, ma'am." She pocketed the phone and continued walking. Above her, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a jet engine roared to life, probably a maintenance test run. The sound made her chest ache in a way that never quite went away. She'd been grounded for 2 years. 2 years since the medical board had looked at her test results and made the decision that ended her flying career. 2 years since she'd sat in a cockpit and felt the raw power of an aircraft responding to her hands. But she was still here, still serving, still finding ways to keep people safe, even if she couldn't do it from 30,000 feet. That had to be enough. It had to be. Friday morning arrived with crystal-clear skies and temperatures perfect for flying. The base hummed with activity, aircraft launching on training missions, crews running exercises, the complex choreography of naval aviation unfolding with practiced precision. The flight ops system, now properly configured, handled the morning schedule without a single error. Pilots got their briefings on time. Maintenance windows aligned perfectly with flight operations. The tower coordinated traffic smoothly. Everything worked the way it was supposed to work. It was, Morrison observed to Elena over coffee, the smoothest operation they'd run in months. Because you fixed what was broken, he said. I fixed the software, Elena corrected. The people fixed everything else. At Givian set hours, Elena received a message from Captain Reeves, requesting her presence in his office. When she arrived, she found not just Reeves, but Lieutenant Kellerman as well. Kellerman stood at attention near the window, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes showing something that might have been dread. Captain Vasquez, Reeves said formally. Lieutenant Kellerman has something he'd like to say to you. Kellerman turned to face her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he took a breath and spoke, his voice steady but weighted with emotion. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. When you arrived here, I treated you with disrespect. I questioned your competence. I made assumptions about your abilities based on nothing more than the fact that you weren't wearing a uniform and didn't come with the credentials I expected to see. He paused, his yaw working. I've spent the last 24 hours learning who you actually are, what you've accomplished, what you've sacrificed, and I'm ashamed of how I spoke to you, how I dismissed you, how I failed to see what was right in front of me. Elena's expression didn't change. She just listened, her hands clasped behind her back. Kellerman continued. Captain Reeves has made it clear that my behavior was unacceptable, that I allowed my own frustration with the system to color how I treated someone who was here to help us. And he's right. He straightened further, if that was possible. Ma'am, I request permission to apologize formally and to ask if there's any way I can make this right. The office went quiet. Reeves watched the exchange carefully, but he didn't intervene. Elena studied Kellerman for a long moment. She could see the genuine regret in his eyes, the way his hands were clenched behind his back, the rigid set of his shoulders that suggested he was bracing for whatever consequence was coming. She'd been in his position once. Early in her career, she'd made assumptions about a senior chief who'd shown up to her squadron without the typical background she expected. She'd questioned his knowledge, pushed back on his recommendations, only to discover later that he'd forgotten more about aircraft maintenance than she'd ever learn. The chief had pulled her aside afterward and told her something she'd never forgotten. The worst mistake you can make in this job isn't screwing up. It's refusing to learn from it. Lieutenant, Elena said quietly. Do you know why your behavior bothered me? Kellerman blinked, clearly not expecting a question. Because it was disrespectful, ma'am? No. Because it was indicative of a larger problem. She stepped closer. You didn't dismiss me because I'm a woman. You didn't dismiss me because of my age or my background. You dismissed me because the system has trained you to believe that competence only comes from people who look a certain way, wear a certain uniform, carry certain credentials. Kellerman's face flushed slightly, but he held her gaze. And that's dangerous, Elena continued. Because in the military, some of the most valuable knowledge comes from people you'd never expect. Enlisted sailors who've been doing the job for 20 years. Contractors who've seen the same problem fail at 10 different bases. Junior officers who notice things that senior leadership has stopped seeing. She paused. If you only listen to people who match your expectations, you're going to miss critical information. And in this job, missing critical information gets people killed. Kellerman nodded slowly. You're right, ma'am. So here's what you're going to do, Elena said. You're not going to apologize to me again. You're going to take what you learned this week and apply it to how you treat every person you encounter from now on. You're going to listen before you judge. You're going to evaluate people based on their competence, not their credentials. And when you inevitably make another mistake, because we all do, you're going to own it and learn from it instead of making excuses. Kellerman's throat worked. Yes, ma'am. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. I will. Elena nodded once. Then we're square, Lieutenant. The relief that washed over Kellerman's face was visible. But Elena wasn't done. One more thing, she said. Captain Reeves tells me you're one of the best tactical planners in this CAG. That when it comes to coordinating complex air operations, you have an instinct that can't be taught. Kellerman looked surprised. He glanced at Reeves, who nodded confirmation. That's a valuable skill, Elena continued. Don't let this week make you doubt your abilities. Let it make you better at recognizing ability in others. I will, ma'am. Thank you. Reeves spoke up. Dismissed, Lieutenant. Kellerman saluted sharply, first to Reeves, then to Elena. As he turned to leave, Elena spoke one more time. Kellerman? He paused at the door. Ma'am? For what it's worth, you weren't wrong about everything. The system is broken. The contractors did make it worse before I got here. And your frustration was justified. She smiled slightly. You just needed to direct that frustration at the right targets. Kellerman almost smiled back. Understood, ma'am. After he left, Reeves let out a long breath. Thank you for handling that the way you did. You expected me to come down harder on him? I expected you to tear him apart. He deserved it. Elena shook her head. He made a mistake. But he owned it. That's more than a lot of officers would do. She paused. Besides, destroying him wouldn't have served any purpose. Teaching him might actually make a difference. Reeves studied her thoughtfully. Admiral Grayson chose the right person for this assignment. We'll see. I still have to write the report. Speaking of which, Reeves said, moving to his desk, I want you to know that whatever you put in that report, I'll support it, even if it reflects poorly on me or my command. Elena raised an eyebrow. That's a dangerous promise to make. It's the unpromised assigning truth. If we have problems, I want them exposed and fixed, not buried and ignored. That's the kind of leadership this base needs, Elena said. The kind that prioritizes mission readiness over personal reputation. Reeves smiled slightly. I learned that from someone a long time ago. A young pilot who was willing to risk her career to tell an admiral that his tactics were going to get people killed. Elena went still. You were there? At the briefing in Bahrain. 2019. I was a commander then, sitting in the back of the room when a lieutenant with 2 years of experience stood up and told a flag officer that his strike plan had gaps big enough to fly a MiG through. Elena remembered that briefing, remembered the way the room had gone silent, remembered how she'd been certain her career was over before it really began. The admiral threatened to have me relieved, she said quietly. And then 3 hours later, intel confirmed you were right. The gaps you identified were exactly where the enemy had concentrated their air defenses. Reeves nodded. The admiral changed the plan, publicly thanked you, and made sure your name got on every fitness report as an officer who had the moral courage to speak truth to power. I didn't know you were there. You inspired a lot of us that day. You showed us what real leadership looked like, not blindly following orders, but having the courage to question them when lives were at stake. He paused. So, when you write your report about this command, I want you to have that same courage. Tell the truth. All of it. Even the parts that make me look bad. Elena nodded slowly. I will, sir. That afternoon, Elena conducted her final interviews. She spoke with enlisted sailors, junior officers, maintenance chiefs, air traffic controllers. She asked them about their challenges, their frustrations, what they needed to do their jobs better, and they told her. Because word had spread about who she was, and more importantly, about what she'd done fixing problems instead of just documenting them, standing up for the people doing the work, risking her cover to prevent an accident. They trusted her, and that trust made them honest in ways they might not have been with an official inspector general team. By 7 hours, Elena had everything she needed for her report. She returned to Building 7 one last time, expecting to find the office empty. Instead, she found it filled with people. Morrison stood near the front. along with Kellerman, Parker, and a dozen other officers and enlisted personnel she'd worked with over the past week. They all came to attention when she walked in. "What's this?" Elena asked. Morrison stepped forward, holding a small wooden plaque. "Ma'am, we know you were here on official business. We know this was an evaluation, not a permanent assignment. But we wanted you to know that you made a difference this week. A real difference." He held out the plaque. Elena took it, turning it over in her hands. It was simple wood, with a brass plate engraved with her call sign and a single line. "Reaper. Saved more than aircraft." "The crew who worked the tower emergency had this made," Morrison explained. "They wanted you to know that what you did that morning, it mattered." Elena's throat tightened. She stared at the plaque, her vision blurring slightly. "I was just doing my job," she said quietly. "No, ma'am," said a voice from the back. Petty Officer First Class Martinez, the sailor who'd been on the Reagan, stepped forward. "You did more than your job. You showed us what it looks like when someone cares more about getting it right than about rank or recognition." Another voice spoke up, Lieutenant Parker. "You showed us that the best leaders sometimes look like people we'd never expect." Morrison added, "And you showed us that this base still has a lot of work to do, but that the people here are worth investing in." Elena looked around the room at all the faces watching her. Some she'd worked with directly. Others she'd only encountered in passing. But they were all here. And they were all looking at her with something she hadn't expected to find. Respect. Not for her rank or her legend, but for what she'd done while she was here. "Thank you," she managed to say. "All of you. This week reminded me why I still serve, even after." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They understood. 3 months later, the changes at NAS Oceana were impossible to miss. The flight ops system ran smoothly, supported by new infrastructure funding that had come through after Elena's report landed on Admiral Grayson's desk and subsequently on desks in Washington. The maintenance tracking system had been replaced entirely. The communications protocols had been modernized. And most importantly, the personnel shortages were being addressed with new billets and better retention incentives. Captain Reeves still commanded the base, but his approach had shifted. Morning briefings now included input from enlisted personnel. System failures were investigated thoroughly instead of being patched over. And when someone identified a problem, they were rewarded for speaking up rather than punished for making waves. Lieutenant Kellerman had taken Elena's words to heart. He'd started a mentorship program pairing junior officers with senior enlisted sailors, designed to break down the barriers of rank and credential that often prevented valuable information from flowing upward. The program had been so successful that other bases were starting to adopt it. Commander Morrison had been promoted to captain and given command of the logistics division for the entire air station. His first action had been to implement the checklist system Elena had created for Seaman Turner, the same system that had helped the young sailor dig himself out of a data backlog. The checklist had since been adopted across multiple commands. And in the tower, Lieutenant Commander Chen kept a photo on his desk, a candid shot. Someone had taken the morning Elena had fixed the corrupted schedule. In it, she was hunched over a keyboard, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen, her expression one of absolute focus. Chen showed the photo to every new controller who came through the tower. "This is Captain Elena Vasquez," he'd say, "call sign Reaper. She saved lives here by knowing her job better than anyone in this room. And she did it while wearing jeans and a hoodie because she understood something important. Competence doesn't need a uniform to be effective." The story of that week had become legend on the base. Not just the tower emergency, but everything that had come before and after. The way she'd let herself be dismissed and underestimated. The way she'd observed instead of commanded. The way she'd fixed problems instead of just documenting them. She'd shown them something they'd needed to see, that real leadership didn't always announce itself with rank and ribbons. Sometimes it arrived quietly, worked hard, and left the place better than it found it. Elena herself had moved on to other assignments. Admiral Grayson had been true to her word. Elena's unique combination of operational expertise and undercover evaluation skills made her invaluable for assessing commands without the distortions that formal inspections created. She'd conducted 3 more evaluations since Oceana. Each time, she'd arrived as someone unremarkable, observed how the command actually functioned, and written reports that led to real improvements rather than just compliance checks. But Oceana had been different. It had been the first time her cover had been completely blown before she'd finished the assignment. The first time she'd had to transition from silent observer to acknowledged expert, and surprisingly, it had worked better than any of her other evaluations. Because once the people at Oceana knew who she was, they'd stopped performing and started trusting. They'd shown her the real problems instead of the sanitized versions. They'd asked for help instead of pretending everything was fine. That honest vulnerability had made her report more accurate and more useful than any she'd written before or since. On a Friday afternoon in early spring, Elena's phone rang. The caller ID showed Captain Reeves. "Captain Vasquez," she answered. "Elena, hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Never too busy for you, sir. What can I do for you? I wanted to let you know that your report came through. The funding, the personnel, the system upgrades, all of it. This base is going to be fully mission capable within 6 months." Elena smiled. "That's outstanding, sir. It wouldn't have happened without you. Without your willingness to see us as we actually were, instead of how we looked on paper. You made it easy, sir. You were willing to face the truth. Not every commander is." There was a pause. "I also wanted to tell you that we're holding a change of command ceremony next month. My relief is coming in from the Reagan, and I'd like you to be here for it, to see what you helped build." Elena hesitated. She'd made it a policy not to revisit the commands she'd evaluated. Clean break, no emotional attachment. But something about Oceana made her want to say yes. "I'll check my schedule," she said. "If I can make it work, I'll be there." "Good. The crew would like to see you again. There are a lot of people here who still talk about the week Reaper came to visit." After the call ended, Elena sat in her office, a real office now, at Naval Air Force's Atlantic headquarters, and thought about that week. She thought about Morrison's exhaustion and how it had transformed into pride. She thought about Kellerman's dismissiveness and how it had evolved into humility. She thought about the sailors who'd saluted her not for her rank but for her perseverance. And she thought about herself, about how serving after being grounded had felt like a punishment at first, like being forced to watch from the sidelines while everyone else played the game. But that week at Oceana had shown her something different. She couldn't fly anymore, but she could still make a difference. She couldn't prevent accidents from the cockpit, but she could prevent them by fixing the systems and the culture that allowed accidents to happen. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was even better than enough. Her phone buzzed with a text from Admiral Grayson. "Heard from Reeves. Oceana's coming along nicely. You did good work there." Elena typed back, "Thank you, ma'am. Next assignment brief is Monday. Another base that needs your particular touch. Interested?" Elena looked at the wooden plaque on her desk. The one from the Oceana Tower crew. Reaper, saved more than aircraft. She smiled and typed her response. "Yes, ma'am, always." 1 year after Elena's visit to NAS Oceana, the base received the Commander, Naval Air Force's Atlantic Battle Efficiency Award, the Battle E, recognizing it as the most combat-ready air station in the entire Atlantic Fleet. At the ceremony, Captain Reeves gave a speech. He talked about systems and standards, training and teamwork, but at the end, he told a story. 15 months ago, he said, someone came to this base. Someone we didn't expect. Someone who didn't look like what we thought excellence looked like. And in 1 week, that person showed us something we'd forgotten. He paused, looking out over the assembled sailors and officers. They showed us that the strongest authority doesn't shout orders, it listens first. That real power isn't in medals or stripes, it's in knowing the truth before anyone hides it. And that the best leaders sometimes arrive quietly, work hard, and leave the place better than they found it. He held up the Battle E pennant. This award represents a year of hard work by every person on this base. But it started with someone who cared enough to tell us the truth, who risked their cover to prevent an accident, who showed us what we could be if we stopped pretending and started performing. In the audience, Lieutenant Commander Morrison, now Captain Morrison, smiled. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander Kellerman stood at attention, his expression proud. And in the back, Petty Officer First Class Martinez stood with his maintenance crew, remembering the night on the Reagan when he'd watched a pilot do the impossible. And the week at Oceana, when he'd watched that same pilot do something even harder, admit she couldn't fly anymore, but keep serving anyway. The ceremony concluded with the formal raising of the Battle E pennant. As it climbed the flagpole and caught the wind, a single F.A. Oceana Hornet streaked overhead, its engines roaring in a perfect flyby. The pilot's call sign was Ghost, a young aviator who'd been inspired by the story of Reaper to push through her own doubts and earn her wings. She'd never met Captain Vasquez in person, but she'd heard the stories, and those stories had mattered, because that's what legends do. They don't just inspire people. They show them what's possible when you refuse to quit, even after you've lost what you thought defined you. 4 years later, Rear Admiral Elena Vasquez, promoted 2 years after her Oceana evaluation, stood in her office at the Pentagon, looking out over the Potomac River. Her chest now carried the ribbons and stars she'd earned, not in the cockpit, but in the work that came after. Distinguished Service Medal, Meritorious Service Medal with 2 gold stars, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat V device. But the thing she was most proud of sat on her desk. A simple wooden plaque from a base she'd visited for 1 week, carrying a message that had meant more to her than any award. Reaper saved more than aircraft. Her phone rang. She answered without checking the caller ID. Vasquez, Elena, it's Marcus Reeves. She smiled. Captain, sorry. Admiral Reeves now. Congratulations on the promotion. Thank you. Listen, I'm calling because I just got orders to stand up a new program. A rotational evaluation system where senior officers go to bases undercover, assess readiness without the dog and pony show, and provide honest feedback to fleet commanders. Elena's smile widened. Sounds familiar. It should. It's based entirely on what you did at Oceana. Admiral Grayson pitched it to the CNO, and it was approved yesterday. They're calling it the Operational Readiness Assessment Program. That's incredible. And they want you to run it. Elena went still. Me? You pioneered this approach. You proved it works. And more importantly, you understand something that most flag officers forget, that the truth only emerges when people aren't performing for rank. Elena looked out at the river, at the city beyond, at all the bases and commands scattered across the world where good people were struggling with broken systems and hoping someone would notice. When do I start? She asked. Reeves laughed. That's the Elena Vasquez I remember. Orders will be cut next week. You'll report to Airland headquarters. You'll have carte blanche to select your team and design the program. And I'll have your support? Always, just like you had mine at Oceana. After the call ended, Elena sat in silence for a long time. She thought about that week 4 years ago, about Morrison and Kellerman and all the people who'd initially dismissed her, then learned to see past their own assumptions. She thought about the tower emergency, the corrupted schedules, the moment when everything could have gone horribly wrong and didn't because she'd been there. She thought about the cost of losing her wings and the unexpected gift that loss had given her, the ability to serve in a different way, to make a different kind of impact. And she thought about all the bases out there, all the commands struggling, all the people who deserved better support and honest evaluation. She could help them, not from a cockpit, but from a different kind of mission. Maybe that had been the plan all along. 10 years after Oceana. The story of the week, Reaper came to visit, had become part of Navy lore. It was told in training pipelines, repeated in leadership courses, referenced in command philosophy papers. The details had morphed over time. Some versions said she'd prevented a mid-air collision. Others claimed she'd exposed a massive corruption scandal. But the core of the story remained true. A decorated aviator had arrived undercover, been dismissed and underestimated, and then revealed her identity while saving the base from disaster. And more importantly, she'd shown that losing what you thought defined you didn't mean losing your ability to serve. At NAS Oceana, there was now a small plaque in the tower control room, mounted near the window overlooking the flight line. It read, "The strongest authority doesn't shout orders, it listens first. Real power isn't in medals or stripes. It's in knowing the truth before anyone hides it. Excellence arrives quietly, works hard, and leaves the place better than it found it." Dedicated to Rad M. Elena Reaper Vasquez, USN. Every new controller who came through that tower learned the story, and every one of them understood what it meant. That competence didn't require permission. That respect was earned, not demanded. And that sometimes the most important person in the room was the one nobody had noticed. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from, and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget?